All right. Hello and welcome to another round of Azure User Group online meetups. I'm joined today by Johan and Michael from Azure Skåne, who are with us today to present this Azure crash course. So initially, I just wanted to say a quick hello and welcome to all of our Azure friends here in Denmark. And for anyone else who's joining from outside of Denmark, of course, everyone is welcome to join us. We are more than happy to see anyone attend these meetups. But welcome to Johan and Michael, and thank you for taking the time out to be with us today to present everything about Azure in 60 minutes or so.
Yeah,
a crash course, yes.
Cool. Well, should we just get started?
I guess so.
I don't really have that much. I have some words from our sponsors at the end of the session, but then I'll just kind of hand it over to you and just say hello and welcome, and then Johan, I guess you can take it from here. If I remove our slide and then add yours in.
Thank you.
There we go. So take it away.
Okay. Thank you very much, Morten, for inviting us. And hello, everyone. Great to see you, even if it's only online. So my name is Johan Åhlén, and I'm based in the Malmö area in South Sweden, just across the bridge from Denmark. And I worked for some really large companies, and I worked for some smaller companies, and now I'm running my own business. And I've been using Azure actually since the beta version in 2009. And I must say, really a lot has happened since that time. And I have a background as a database guy. I've been working with a SQL Server databases for about 25 years. So I was earlier I was running the Swedish SQL Server user group. And now I'm running the Azure user group in South Sweden together with Michael, who will also be presenting here today. And Azure, it is literally available everywhere. So Microsoft, they are now experimenting with Azure data centers at the bottom of the sea. I guess they get free cooling at least. And you can get an Azure modular data center delivered almost anywhere in the world in really remote places. And if you need Azure in space, well, you can get that too. And finally, we are even getting an Azure region in Denmark. Still, I haven't seen any release date, but it's been announced. So that's really something to look forward to. So what is a public cloud? Well, I saw a joke that someone said, there is no cloud. It's just someone else's computer. And there's definitely some truth to that. The cloud, that basically means it's a computing resources rental service. And this is a map of Azure and the Azure regions. So each dot here is a so-called Azure region, and they are open to anyone. And that is why it's called a public cloud, because it's available to the public. Well, there are some exceptions on this map. For instance, the US Department of Defense region, I guess they don't want people outside of the US to access that. But otherwise, it's all public, it's public places. And public cloud, that is usually the cheapest and easiest way to use Azure. But Azure also offers a private cloud. And this is very useful if you don't want to expose your data. And you can even run a private cloud disconnected. So you can use it in remote places or on a ship or some other place where you don't have an internet access. So the first option is the Azure Stack Hub. And it is very great because it can run most of the Azure services. It can run disconnected, as I said, but it comes with a bit of a price tag. It's a bit of an investment because it needs quiet, powerful, dedicated hardware to run. But there are more options. So a new option that's appeared is Azure Stack HCI, which stands for Hyper-Converged Infrastructure. And it can run on your existing hardware. So you can even test it at home. You can install it yourself. So like I have done. So sorry about that. Since I installed it, it consumes all of my electricity in the house. So yeah, just be careful. The Azure Stack HCI, as I said, it's a software-only offering that you can install, but it can run only a limited number of Azure services right now. Maybe that will increase in the future, but still it is very useful. So for existing data centers, I can absolutely recommend looking into the Azure Stack HCI. And then there's Azure Stack Edge. And the Edge, that is basically, it's offered as a hardware that you can bring with you out there on the field. I mean, that's what Edge means. That's, you can bring it to remote places with no internet connection or anything. And then it can run your Azure workloads for IoT and AI, etc. So you can, deploy them to your Azure Stack Edge boxes. You can bring them in a backpack and use them. And when you need to, synchronize and update things, you just bring the devices back to civilization again and connect them to the internet. But of course, you can also mix public and private cloud. You can even mix multiple clouds. And then you get a hybrid cloud. And to make it simpler to manage a hybrid cloud, there is the Azure Arc. And the Azure Arc can even manage things like virtual machines in other clouds, non-Azure clouds. So it is really a multi-cloud solution. So I would say that Azure Arc, it's like one place to rule them all. So yeah, I can definitely recommend looking into it. There are three main types of cloud services. And first of all, there's the infrastructure as a service. And that means that Microsoft or the cloud vendor, they are responsible for the physical servers, for the physical network, for the physical storage and virtualization. And you are responsible for the rest. And that gives you the highest flexibility and is very useful in many cases. And typical examples are virtual machines, networking and firewalls, and storage. So these are the kind of infrastructure services that you find in Azure. But there's other levels like the platform as a service. And in that case, Microsoft, they are responsible for the operating system, software updates, security updates, etc. So you are just responsible for the applications running on these platforms. And typical examples are the application services in Azure, like Azure Web Apps. If you run website or API backend. Also, it's databases and BI services in Azure. They are platform as a service. Logic apps, Azure Functions, etc. And finally, there's software as a service. And in that case, Microsoft are responsible for everything to make sure your apps are running. You are just responsible for configuration. So we're talking about hosted applications. And a good example is Office 365. And then there's some talk about serverless. And serverless, well, I would not say it's a type of cloud service. It's more like platform as a service, and it's a pure pay-per-consumption model. So you don't pay any fixed monthly or hourly fees or something. You just pay per execution, like Azure Functions, for example. Each Azure region, it has at least 3 data centers that are connected together. And why is this important? Well, that's for high availability and redundancy. So if one data center goes down, hopefully the other ones will be working. But some Azure regions, they are better than others because they have these availability zones. And if they have availability zones, then the data centers, they are grouped into then they have 3 availability zones, and the data centers are grouped into these availability zones. And each availability zone, it has its own independent power, independent cooling, and independent networking. So if, let's say, there's a power outage or something, then there's quite good chance that the other zones still will be working. And actually, there can be multiple data centers in a single availability zone. So you can get quite good redundancy in those regions. And storage, it can be configured to be just locally redundant, and that is a cheaper storage. Then it can all be within one availability zone or in a region without availability zones. But you can also choose that it should be zone redundant. And that means that Microsoft, they guarantee that your storage will be replicated across availability zones. And then it will be in at least 3 places with independent power, independent cooling, independent networking. So that gives higher availability. And the same goes for virtual machines. They can also be spread across different availability zones. But there's also something that's called paired regions. And that's, you can choose to have data geo-replicated. And that means that it will be also replicated to a whole different region. So if something really bad happens, and let's say East US goes down, well, then it is paired with the West US. So the West US could take over. And if you're chosen to have your data geo-replicated, it will be available in the paired region. That is probably something that's not going to happen very often. That's kind of, say, disaster recovery solution. And then you might also have some data loss because it's not synchronously replicated. So that's about the regions and availability zones. Let's now talk about core Azure services. And picking the most important Azure services, that's an almost impossible task because there are so many great Azure services. And there are new services coming all of the time. So on this link here, you can always find a current list of all Azure services. And let's begin with the first one. So the Azure Active Directory. You all have this because if you're using Azure, you must have an Azure Active Directory. It is included. And all your security depends on it. That's why it is very important, and it's important to learn how it works. And it's available in different editions. So the higher editions, they give you better security options. And here is an overview of the editions and the features. So there's the free one, which comes automatically with Azure. And then if you're using Office 365, you get a slightly upgraded version. And then there are 2 premium editions, the P1 and P2. And the P1, it gives you features like conditional access. So you can say that admin things you can only do if you're sitting at your office. So it will check the IP address. So let's say someone tries to connect from Russia. Even if they have your credentials, they will be denied to do any admin things. And then with P2, you get even more features like risky account detection and privileged identity management, which is like just-in-time access for administrators. And you can then remove the admin rights after they are finished. You can do access reviews. And it's important to know that Azure Active Directory is not only for managing users, but it's also for managing apps. And even computers and devices can join an Azure Active Directory. And apps, they can get their permissions managed here. You can even manage permissions and security for non-Azure apps. So it is not only for Azure, it is a general identity service for authentication and authorization. Next service, Azure Virtual Networks. And it maybe doesn't sound like the most exciting thing, but it is very important, especially for security. So always connect your Azure resources through virtual networks. Don't be lazy and use a public internet, because this gives you much better control. And with virtual networks, you basically control all your traffic. So you can set up traffic filtering, a bit easier with network security groups, and more advanced with Azure Firewall. You can set up route tables, you can have manage your public IP addresses, you can have load balancers, etc. So basically everything you can have in a physical network, you can have also in an Azure virtual network. And then you can also connect your Azure virtual networks to your on-premise networks. So you can set up site-to-site VPN. That means you connect a whole network to Azure. And you can have a point-to-site VPN. And that basically means that you give users access. So they install a VPN client, and they can connect to your Azure virtual network. And then finally, there's something called Azure Express Route. And the Express Route, that is your own private dedicated connection to Azure. And that gives you the absolutely best security and speed. But of course, that's also the most costly option. And in that case, it doesn't send the traffic through the internet. It's a dedicated connection outside of the internet. Then there's Azure App Services. And why do I show a rabbit here? Well, there was this commercial in Sweden, at least, about Duracell batteries. They said that the Duracell rabbit, it just kept running and running and running. And the same, I would say, happened to my websites that are built on Azure App Services. They've been just running and running and running for years with no maintenance or anything at all. It just kept running. And Azure App Services, it supports the most important platforms like ASP.NET, .NET Core, of course, PHP, Python, Java, Docker. So anything you can package as a Docker container can be deployed as an Azure App Service. And again, it's very easy to deploy, but the biggest advantage, I say, is the maintenance, that it takes care of all the maintenance for you. So it's very, very easy and time-saving to use. And some of the features that come with Azure App Services, that's automatic scaling. So it can scale based on your workload. So then it can add more nodes for you. And it can reduce the number of nodes when there's less traffic, so you don't pay too much. And it's easy to integrate with DevOps, continuous integration, continuous deployment. It supports multiple slots for development, test, and production. And when you're done testing, you can just do a switch between your slots, so your test slot becomes a new production. That means you can get things deployed with almost zero downtime. And then it supports also monitoring and remote debugging, of course. So you can connect with the Visual Studio, and you can place breakpoints. You can catch exceptions in your websites that are running. This is usually not a good idea with a production website, so that's more maybe for your test slot. And of course, it integrates with the Key Vault for HTTPS encryption and that kind of stuff. So that's a really useful Azure App Service. And then I got started with Logic apps when I needed to schedule jobs in Azure. And for instance, you can use it to build intelligent monitoring solutions, to build maintenance solutions, etc. So if you have, for instance, a SQL script that you wish to run every day, well, Logic apps is one way of scheduling it. And it can also automate processes and workflows because it works. It's not only for scheduling, but it can react to events and messages. You have various kinds of triggers. And it comes with a lot of ready-made connectors. So it can be triggered by, for instance, incoming emails in Outlook. And then you can, write the logic, what it should do about the email. It could look at the subject, it can look at the body text, etc., and take decisions. And it comes with a lot of ready-made connectors, so it's easy to integrate. And it's also low-code. And low-code, that means it's more of a graphical user interface. So you can, show things also to non-technical users. Then there's Azure SQL Database. And as I said, I'm a database guy. And SQL databases, that is one of the absolutely most common ways to store data. And the Azure SQL Database, it's similar to SQL Server, the on-premises SQL Server. But it comes with automation, so it does most of the administrative tasks for you automatically. And you will always get the latest version. Microsoft will keep updating it for you. And it's always replicated across 3 data centers. So it offers a very good high availability. It's very easy to scale it. So just a minute or so to increase the capacity or decrease the capacity. And it can do some automatic performance tuning of databases, some kind of AI magic in there. Still, I just want to say a little warning here, because in most cases it's good results, but in some cases it might slow down your database. So still, there is room for some really good performance tuning experts on SQL databases. And it comes with backups that have a point-in-time restore functionality. So let's say you make some kind of big mistake, you accidentally delete the table or do some stupid update, like I have done sometimes. Well, then you can go back in time and restore the database it looked like 10 minutes before. So you can, you restore just a backup of it, so you can just, restore from the one specific table, so you don't destroy any other data. And it comes also with intelligent threat protection, so that it can detect things like SQL injections and let's say someone is trying to guess your password and doing a lot of brute force attempts. Well, it will detect that too. And then for transferring data, there's the Azure Data Factory. And it's a bit similar to the SQL Server integration services, if you've heard about that. So it's a so-called ETL tool, which stands for Extract, Transform, Load. And basically, it can read data from a source, and it can write the data to destination, and it can do some transformations in between. So you can read from a SQL database and write to data lake, or you can read from Azure Synapse and write to SQL database or file or whatever. And it can even connect to your on-premises data sources. So you just need to install a local agent. And of course, it supports also scheduling and monitoring. And then finally, does anyone recognize this programming language? I'm quite sure this will not be part of a certification test or so, at least not right now, but I think it's so cool, so I had to include it. This is Azure Quantum. So that's like a quantum computer as a service. And the language here, that is Q#, a bit similar to C#, but it's for quantum computer programming. And yeah, you can download and install it, and you can try it. And there's a simulator, but you can actually also try it and run things on a real quantum computer, which right now have a limited number of qubits available because it's developing. It's still early, but I've been looking at this, and it will be a real game changer with the quantum computing. So, for instance, the encryption systems we have today, I mean, with real quantum computers, they will not be so secure anymore. So, yeah, there will be really a lot of new things to learn here. And if you learn this, you could maybe start a completely new career as a quantum computing specialist. And this is in preview, and you get some free time for testing on a real quantum computer. So that's really cool. Let's now talk about tools for working with Azure. And this is a list of the current tools that I use. And I don't use all of them daily, but I think it's good to know that they exist. And first of all, there's a Visual Studio Code, which is a free code editor and development environment that you can download from Microsoft. And not everybody knows this, but Visual Studio Code comes with some very useful extensions for Azure. So you just click on the extensions icon, and then you search for Azure, and it will give you a list of very useful extensions or plugins, as I call them. And there are a lot of them. And first one to recommend is Azure Resource Manager. And you know what that is? Maybe not, or maybe, but Azure Resource Manager, that means that you can script your Azure resources. And that is a much better way to manage them than doing things manually in the portal. So then you can manage things like it's an infrastructure as code, and you can have source control for keeping a history of what you have done in Azure. And if you download that, you get a really nice editor with IntelliSense for writing these templates for Azure Resource Manager. Because these templates, they can be, a little tricky to write. It's maybe not the easiest language. And if you're looking into Bicep, which is the next generation syntax for these templates, well, there's a plugin for that also, of course. And I think, yeah, I'm seeing new plugins appearing all the time. So keep an eye on these Visual Studio Code extensions. Some of you may have been around since this time, or maybe even since this time, and then you know the power of command line tools. And there are a couple of those available for Azure. So who would think that in 2021, you manage the latest cloud technology through a DOS prompt? So the Azure CLI, it can be run from a DOS, and you can run it from inside PowerShell as well. But it's a command line tool for managing Azure. And it's multi-platform, so yeah, you can run it on Linux or Mac OS also. And it is designed to be as user-friendly and simple as possible, so you should need to type as little as possible. And from here, you can do many Azure tasks easily. And it's helpful with helpful text, and it's easy to get started. And it means you can script the things you're doing. But then there's also Azure PowerShell. And that is basically modules. It's a module you install in PowerShell. Just make sure you install the right module. You have to install the AZ module. Don't install the other one, because they don't coexist very well. So there's an older module, and then they rewrote everything to the AZ module. Use that one. And the difference here compared to Azure CLI is that Azure PowerShell, it is much more detailed. So you have more parameters. You can do much more things, but it also means a lot more typing and a bit harder to learn. So for more advanced tasks, I recommend using Azure PowerShell, and for smaller, simpler things, there's Azure CLI. And then there's the AZ copy. And that's a simple tool to, if you wish to upload a bunch of files to Azure storage, or download things, or maybe just copy between two storage accounts, well, then AZ copy is your tool. But some of you probably prefer tools with a graphical user interface to manage the cloud. And the good news is that there are some of those tools also available. So first, there's the Azure Storage Explorer, which can help you upload and download and manage Azure storage, data lake, blobs files, etc. Maybe it sounds familiar. So I talked about AZ copy before, and actually Azure Storage Explorer is using AZ copy in the background. So it's a graphical user interface for AZ copy. But it also has some other features. So you can use it to access virtual machine disks, and it can access Cosmos DB accounts. So it's good for migrating virtual machines from on-premises to Azure. And then there's the Azure Data Studio, which is some more database development and querying tool. And it works with Azure databases and on-premises databases as well, like SQL Server. And it comes also with very useful plugins that you can download. And again, new plugins are appearing all the time. So there's a plugin for machine learning. There's a plugin for schema compare. And schema compare, that is very useful. So it means you can compare one database with another one, and it will detect the changes and the differences. So if there's any differences in table definitions, or columns or views or whatever, it will find them for you. It also comes with a plugin for profiling SQL databases, and that is very important for finding performance problems. And this is the only user-friendly way to do a profiling of an Azure SQL database currently, from what I know. And it supports running Jupyter notebooks, and it is cross-platform, and it has a nice editor with IntelliSense. So it's a very good tool. And then there's the Cloud Shell. And sometimes you are at a client site or some place where you can't install any software. And then it is very, very nice that in your web browser, in the portal, there's this little icon for the Cloud Shell. You just click on it, and it will open a terminal window for you. And in this terminal window, you will have access to Azure PowerShell, Azure CLI, and AZ copy. and no installation or anything needed. It just runs in your browser. It can even be run on your mobile phone. And finally, before I hand over to Michael, I just want to mention some resources. So I've written some blog posts, you can see here, on my website, howtocode.info, where you can read more about these top Azure services and the best tools for working with Azure. And also, yeah, this is based on the certification, what you need to learn to take this certification. And I really encourage you to take it. And then that's the third link here to the certification information, where you can read more about services and tools. And now it is time to switch to Michael. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Johan. That was nice. So, hi, my name is Michael. I'm gonna go through some additional security and other topics. First, I would want to say Eid Mubarak to everyone that's celebrating. It's a nice holiday. And then I would want to make a small claim that since we can't go to physical events freely anymore, I'm trying to get one of these shirts eventually. This is the new logo. I have the old one. So if you know of a conference where we're handing out these shirts, please let me know, and I will try to make that happen for myself. Yes, my name is Michael. I'm a cloud engineer from Avanade, Denmark. I live in Malmö, so I used to take the bridge until the pandemic hit. Now I do most remote. I'm an Azure MVP, and I run Azure Skåne user group together with Johan. The hashtag Azure Skåne is the one that we use mostly. You can find me on Twitter, and I also have a blog where I write sometimes. So my topic here is that I will talk about some security, networking features, tools, and services that Microsoft provides with their cloud services here. So you would basically, you have a Lego set of components in cloud, and you can build whatever you would like. So the security here, you would look at it as a layered approach, and this is a simplified view of all the topics or all the possibilities that you have. We would start with the subscription. That would be one great way of segmenting your security. On the top level above subscription is actually Active Directory or Azure AD tenant, but we'll get to that also later on. Now the subscriptions, you could have dev, test, prod, or if you segment it by region, that could also represent your security levels that you want to implement or posture that you want to implement. There's no default communication between any subscriptions, because in essence a subscription is empty of any services per default, kind of. But you can have multiple subscription answering to the same Active Directory Azure AD tenant, and you can connect your Active Directory to that. So you would have a unison experience there. We would then look at virtual networks as the next logical step if you want to go with infrastructure as service. And one common or the most common scenario today is where you do a lift and shift. You take your existing workloads and then you move them to to the cloud. So you take your virtual machines, you set them in Azure. In that case, you have to have some kind of a network component possibility in the cloud, and virtual networks are there for that. They are free of cost, so you can have how many you want, which is also a nice one. And there's also no default communication between the networks. That's something you have to set up. Then you would look at network security groups. So you have the subscription as a delimiter, you have the networks as a delimiter. Then you would have network security groups where you apply on the virtual or on the subnets of the network, or actually you can also apply network security groups on network interfaces that you have put in the virtual networks, in the subnets. The network security group is access control list level capability where you can open ports and allow traffic to flow here and there. Then to make it more flexible, there's something called application security group. Now the application security group is basically the same construct as the network security group, but the application security group is where you could create your rule and based on tags, and one tag could be SQL Server. So you base your rule on the SQL Server needs, and then you would apply that application security group on all your SQLs, for example. Then we go into something called firewall, Azure Firewall. Usually you a company today, they already have a firewall set up. They probably have F5, Checkpoint, Palo Alto, or something else. And you can take those firewalls and place them in the cloud. You have to place them within a virtual network, but you would be able to leverage your existing setup also in the cloud. The thing that you wouldn't get there is the managed service that Azure Firewall is. It's basically a service that you implement where you set up your rules. You have your inbound protection for HTTPS, for non-HTTPS protocols. You can also have network level protection for all ports and protocols. And if you combine those, you have additional layers. But the thing is that it's a managed service, so you wouldn't have to have it look to the resiliency or have it load balance or failover capability if one firewall would go down. So it's a really neat feature there with all the promises of cloud given to you in that service. So that's Azure Firewall. It's a nice component. So if we would dig into the virtual networks, so the virtual networks are basically a CIDR range that you can apply on subscription and region level. And if you see on the in my little snippet there picture, I've tried to provision 2/16 CIDR networks, and I also get a small notification that you have overlapping IP addresses. So from a security point of view, you would create multiple networks, virtual networks, for different kind of purposes. And if you go through the portal, you get a really nice wizardy experience. It's a good way to get started. It's a good way to build stuff, but eventually you want to automate this and do it with ARM templates or biceps or scripts or CI/CD setup DevOps. But if you do it from the portal, you get this wizard experience and you get to know the services. Once you have your virtual network, you can segment that network in subnets. And this is also good if you would, for example, have a layered application where you have front end and you have back end. You would want to segment that in subnets. So that's also a security construct and enabled to you on the virtual network level. Then there's something called service endpoint, and that's policies to allow traffic to specific Azure resources from that virtual network. And they will do that over this service endpoint. So you would limit your virtual network to speak with those Azure resources. And if you can look on the right hand side of this picture, you see that there are services that you can enable on the subscription level that you want this on the network level that you want this network to be able to speak with. So if I would click in Microsoft SQL, it would be able to speak with Microsoft SQLs. Eventually, when you start building out your network setup, you will have multiple networks. In the example I have here, I have virtual network A, B, and C, and you would want to have these virtual networks to speak to each other. In the old days, really old days, there was XML files that you had to shift and connect the virtual networks with, so the traffic was able to go over. And now there's just appearing that you enable. It's like a click in the portal, and once you do that, the traffic can flow. One common scenario that usually happens is that you eventually want VNet A talk to VNet C, and that's an issue because it's a non-transitive scenario, so that the networks doesn't support that. There's constructs around that where you use user-defined routes, or eventually you can level up and go to something called VNet, Azure VNet Hub or Hub, and that's another service that you can leverage. So if we would look at a common setup where with infrastructure as service, you would have a hub virtual network. This is a hub and spoke model. That's a common one, where you segment the virtual network base scenarios or base components within one virtual network. It could also be a subscription, so you would be able to control the access on subscription level. We will talk about managed groups eventually, but if you would be a bigger company, you would probably have your own network group, and they would be the ones that controls this domain with the hub virtual network. From that, you would connect to the spokes, and the spokes can be virtual networks within a subscription or a resource group or whatever, but that would be a spoke. And then you peer them to the hub, and from the hub you control all the other external or on-premise that would also be internal connectivity. That's where you have in the hub you would have your gateways. That's where you control all the firewalls with the rules for in and out traffic. Bastion would be like the jump hosts that controls that network. And also in this picture you have Azure Monitor for all the diagnostics and log collections. So this is a common scenario that you would have. Now, if you talk about a little bit more about some features, tools, and services. If you would have an application that you would want to publish externally and you would want to control some rules there, for example, sticky sessions or SSL offloading, etc. There's a service called Application Gateway, and it's a layer 7 load balancer. Within Application Gateway, you can also enable web application firewalls, and the web application firewalls is an add-on to the Application Gateway, where you also get some cool security features like OWASP scanning and so on. And this is a really useful service when you have external sites or external services that you want to publish. Then I want to mention another tool or feature, service actually, That's called Bastion host. It's a jump host as a service. So if you would have your virtual network in Azure, you would want to be able to log in somehow to that network and control the services or the virtual machines within that network. Bastion host is a managed service. It's in the background. It's a container, I believe, or a virtual machine that enables you to work within that network and without exposing any uh, endpoints out. So you would connect to the Bastion host from the portal, and then you would be able to manage your services. So it's a good secure feature. And this is also part of the wizard when you create a network, where you get this step-by-step experience where they tell you, would you want to enable or disable this? And when you do that, you would probably have to know a little bit about this. It's usually pretty overwhelming if you haven't done anything like this before, but creating a virtual network is basically an easy thing. But when you go through all the steps or all the options you have today, you get a bit overwhelmed because there's so much, and then you get this analysis paralysis. So I highlighted some of the security features here with the Bastion host, DDoS protection, and firewall. So all of those can be enabled in the experience when you create a virtual network. Firewall we already mentioned, so I want to talk a little bit more about DDoS. Now, per default, all services in Azure have a base level DDoS protection, but there's also something that you can enable additionally if you want to really keep it secure. And yeah, there's multiple options there to have this DDoS protection. Another one is Azure Key Vault. And Azure Key Vault, basically, the name speaks for itself. It's a vault where you store your keys or secrets or certificates. And when you do that, you can take out all the secrets, connection strings, etc. for applications in the code, and reference to the key vault instead, so you wouldn't have to store anything within your applications. So it's a really nice feature, this Azure Key Vault. Something that's also possible for you to leverage, and you should, is something called Azure Security Center. And what this does is it scans your subscription and all your services that you run within that subscriptions. It looks at the configuration and highlights stuff that is a potential risk, security risk, and gives you a score for it, how severe it is, and you could gather that list and fix your security posture. Basically, what Azure Security Center does, it is pushing out a bunch of policies, and we will mention policies soon. And those policies then puts up these guardrails and tells you on an audit level all the stuff that you need to consider. And this is a service that's actually enabled. It should be enabled by default, and if it isn't, then please do it. You get a secure score, and you can use this secure score to improve your security posture. As I said, you get these recommendations, and the recommendations are really just prescriptive. They tell you what's wrong and what you can do to mitigate that. It gives you also this list that tells you if you mitigate this, your security score will increase with this much percentage. It tells you on a detailed level all your resources that are, let's say, within a risk or is missing something. Messages here could be enable FTP should be enabled. FTPS shouldn't be open for you to use for your services. It's also mute something here. And Security Center is also free. It has a free tier. Then if you up your game and go to Azure Defender, you also tie into the whole Defender suite. And then you enable it, the scanning inside VMs also. So that's a really recommended service to look at, and something you should know if you're going for the basic AZ 900. And now I want to bring up something here. Legacy AD. And why do we say legacy AD? That's a provocative thing that someone said, that the current Active Directory that we use is legacy because Azure Active Directory will take over. Yeah, it's not really that yet. Azure Active Directory is basically an identity as a service. It operates on SAML, OAuth, PSFed, etc. So it has a different level. So it's not Active Directory that operates on Kerberos and LDAP levels. But it does enable a lot of good stuff. You have built-in federations to many third-party services and solutions. That is something that's abbreviated from your current Azure Active Directory that you probably have on premises running in your data centers. To build federations is a pain, and that's kind of abbreviated for you in here with a lot of direct connections. There's something cool called conditional access. So you could tell you can secure your identity by challenging your identity. If you log in from Malmö at 1 o'clock and you log in from Germany at 2 o'clock, then there's something that's not right in that, and then you would ask for you would challenge for an extra authentic to improve or prove your your ID with for example, another password, or you have to type in your password that you usually don't if you just use your identity app. It also enables to give you single sign-on across cloud solutions with these connections. There's a self-service password reset capability within Azure Active Directory. And you also have direct connections to business and business to consumer instances. So that's also a big topic that's good for Azure Active Directory. But basically, you would have your on-premises Azure on-premises Active Directory. With all your users and all your security groups, etc. So you would then have your Azure Active Directory. You need to connect these two somehow, because you could create users in your Azure Active Directory, but they wouldn't have any rights on your on-premise side. So what is the common standard today is that you create everything on premises, then you have something called Azure AD Connect. It's a small agent that you install somewhere on your DC. You connect that with your Azure Active Directory, and then you sync all your users and your security groups to Azure. This then gives you all these possibilities with syncing to other parties with the federations, single sign-on, yeah, etc. So it also gives us something called RBAC, and I think we have that in the next slide here. And RBAC then is the security posture within Azure, role-based access control. Let's see if we have something more about that. And role-based access control goes into this with governance. So we talked about subscriptions. You can have multiple subscriptions. And one good thing to know about subscriptions is that there are different offerings of subscriptions. You have there's actually one free one free offering. You have the enterprise offering. There's dev offering. If you have an MSDN subscription, you can have a MSDN subscription. You can enable an Azure subscription via that. So it's good to know that there's different offerings on the subscriptions. And if, for example, if you have a dev subscription, there's a lower cost on the run for those services. So if you want to govern your cloud, you would look at your subscriptions. Then you will have something called management groups. And the management groups is a construct that enables you to have a hierarchy that you push out to the underlying subscriptions. You can group them with some rules. You can enable tags on that, and tags is a really good construct that you would need to tag all your services, and it also comes over to the cost control that I'm going to mention. You wouldn't want to have any services running without having an owner, or at least knowing if it's test or production, unless you have that already within the subscription boundaries that you have set up. The Azure Advisor, that's another service. You could compare it with Security Center, for example. What Azure Advisor does, it's a free consultant basically that looks at all your services running, and then it tells you if you do like this, you can save some money, or if you do like this, you can up your security. And it gives you some proactive guidance. It also tells you, for example, if you're running a service that's going to be deprecated eventually, or has a end of life that you need to act on, it would advise you to move off that. And similar to Security Center, it actually ties into Security Center also. The advisor would tell you stuff that you can do on your performance, on your cost, on high availability, etc. So that's also a really neat feature. And imagine this is something that would be really difficult to implement in your current data center setup. Policies, I mentioned that before. And this is all a part of the governing the cloud. So Microsoft, they build a bunch of policies, and you can build them yourself. As you see here, they are mentioned as built-in. Here I have a built-in policy. If I enable this, it tells me that backup on VMs without given tag to an existing recovery service vault in the same location. So it needs to configure a tag, for example. And there's a bunch of these built-in policies that you can enable and look at. And these are also tied into all the ISO standards and all other security or all other industry certifications requirements that are there. So policy is a really good tool. And with policies, you can prevent cloud sprawl. And cloud sprawl is basically that you don't have any control of what's happening. You have opened the door to the data center and everyone runs in and does whatever they want, and you can't control it. With policies, you can say that we don't deploy servers or services in East Europe, in East US. We only use West Europe, for example, and we don't use virtual machines with this queue, so you don't allow them to use the bigger SKUs because you know that they don't need that, for example. So that's a really good thing with policies, that you are able to put up these guardrails. And the policies are also coming over to this with the compliance. Now, compliance, it's not like that you can enable a policy and then you're compliant. Everything in cloud is a shared responsibility. And if you look in the beginning of Johan's presentation, we have this infrastructure as service, platform as a service, and software as a service. If you go over to software as a service, there's less things that is your responsibility, but there's still things that is your responsibility. So everything you run in cloud is a shared responsibility. Now there's something called Trust Center, and there's a similar thing for Microsoft 365 services. And there's a compliance manager in there that give you all of those recommendations would give you. It would give you recommendations to be on the right compliance level, but still there's activities that you need to do. So again, with policies in the compliance level, you can get a good overview with a compliance score, and it tells you also which services are not compliant depending on what policy you have enabled. And as I mentioned, for example, if you do ISO 27001, or if you have a HIPAA compliance needs, or if you do healthcare in UK, you probably need the NHS compliance. And these policies are something that you can push out on your subscription, and it would tell you what needs to be fixed or not fixed for you to be compliant, but it's still your responsibility. And that's sometimes a hard pill to swallow for some of the people that starting with this journey. But still, if you would do this in your own data center, you wouldn't have this built-in policy capability that just scans your environment and tells you what you need to fix to actually be compliant. So it's a really nice feature. Now, cost control. You need to have cost control. Otherwise, you'll be paying a lot of money. Everything in cloud costs. It's not like you used to do a couple of years ago when you bought a set of hardware for a bunch of money. You started using that hardware and then you used it for as many years that it actually was able to run. In Azure, you pay for everything all the time. So you need to have that under control. You need to know what is costing you. There are possibilities to set up budgets that you enable on resource groups. You can have alerts tied to that. There's graphs to give you insights and visibility. And the tags, if you have that implemented, it can give the accountability. If you have cost control, just having, for example, a show back telling a project or a service owner, this is what the cost is for your service to run. It gives a lot of information for that group of people, so maybe they think differently when they design the services next time, or they skill up and try to do it better in a more cost-effective way. There's also things like reservations and hybrid benefits. There's more stuff that you can enable that kind of drives down the cost. And actually, Azure Advisor tells you you're using these VMs and you could use hybrid benefits for these, or these VMs have been running for this time. If you do reservations, you would save this and this much money. So that's really nice with cost control. So one of the final things here, though, what am I paying for and how do I get refunds for cloud downtime? And the cloud downtime would be that someone breaches an SLA, a service level agreement that they have on a service. And something that you need to think of is that if you have a service that is built up on different services from Microsoft, if you have an application that's built on different services, that has a composite SLA where you put these service level agreement values together. For example, in this case, you have an app service and a SQL database. Those two together probably is a public website that you would have. And as you can see, if you put these together, the SLA goes down. Just to give you a view of what that means. So if I would have 5 nines at the bottom of the upper table, it means that I would have 5.26 minutes downtime per year. If I would have 5.26 minutes downtime per year, it's a SLA breach from the provider side. Usually in a provider, service provider and a customer level agreement, you would have a fine or a contract. There would be a fine for the service provider. In Microsoft's case or in any cloud vendor's case, it's not really possible to have a fine. So that's why, for example, if my SLA was breached, I would only get the service credits for that time lost. And it would be on the SLA per service. It would not be on the composite SLA. So that's something to keep in mind. With all that said, there's probably something that people discuss, that they need to have a cloud strategy to keep all of this in control. But again, these are just big stuff that in the big picture, it's stuff that you learn while you do the transition or the walk. So some ending recommendations here then. Johan also mentioned this. If you're going for days at 900, for example, the overarching fundamentals, there's a excellent learning module path that you can do on Microsoft Learn. It would give you most of the insights that you need to actually pass the test. And with that, I think we are finished.
Yeah, I think it's time for the Q&A.
Yep.
Yeah,
cool. Thank you so much for the presentation. So I don't know. So Johan, you answered a few of the questions already.
Well, I started, but I answered one of the questions. But I have four questions. So the first question was the difference between Azure Firewall and Network Security Group.
The difference between them.
Yes.
Yeah, so firewall is a service where you actually can define rules on a granular level. Network Security Group is basically an access control list where you say you allow ports to be open, and firewall is a deeper level where you can have some logic on it, like you do in a regular firewall setup. So I wouldn't recommend to use a network security group as a security solution for production, for example. But it's still valid for securing network in and out traffic. I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah,
I think so.
So yeah. Next, another question was about security layer. Is there any security layer at management group level? Actually, I answered it already, but I think we can repeat it.
Okay,
so,
yeah.
Yes. So yeah, I answered yes. You can manage security at the management group level. You can assign roles and that kind of stuff. So that's the highest level where you can assign things. I don't know if you have anything more to add to that, Michael.
No, well, basically, the management groups is also where you could set the top level security. If you used to group policies in Active Directory, you could think of it as the same capabilities, where you can set a top level security. For example, I would allow this security group to have. This security group to have these roles within Azure subscription. And then I could push that out to all the subscriptions within all my management groups if I have that on the top level management group. So I don't know if maybe that's not the question, but
yeah. So it's good for managing security for multiple subscriptions at the same time.
it is, and you can, yeah.
And then there was a question about if you have different subscriptions under the same management group and they have their own virtual networks, do I need to configure VNet peering? And the answer to that question is yes. If you wish those VNets to communicate with each other, you need to set up peering between them.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, actually, there's one more option, and that is you can actually set up a VPN between VNets. So VPN is not only between on-premises networks and Azure VNets. So VPN can also be used between different Azure virtual networks as well. But peering is probably what you should go for. So yes, it can be. That is the way to do it. And then finally, there was one question about Azure AD Connect.
Does this mean my on-prem Win Server AD and Azure AD Connect needs access internet to talk to Azure AD for sync? It needs 443 to do that. Yes.
Yes. Well, actually, it needs Azure connectivity. It doesn't need really internet connectivity. So, yeah, I mean, in case you were running something like an Azure Express route or something, it could communicate that way as well. But and it could communicate over a VPN, of course, to Azure. But yes, so it has to be able to connect to the Azure AD to be able to synchronize.
Yes.
So I think that's it. I haven't seen any more questions.
Yeah, no, I think that's we reached the end of the list of the questions that were posted in the chat. So I don't know, unless you have any questions for each other. No?
No. Not really.
No,
but so well, I guess I have one question in relation to the things that you went through. So is there one thing that you can point out where you say this is a good place to start if you're not all that familiar with Azure? So a good place to start. I guess that kind of depends on your background, whether you're a developer or an IT pro. So there might be different points of entry, or a data science person, for example. But yeah, what would you recommend?
Well, I would definitely recommend looking into that AZ900 certification because it has lots of really good learning materials. And it is good because many people who work with Azure, they start with 1 or 2 services, but they don't get the full picture. So if you start, studying for that certification, it gives you the full picture of how Azure works, and you will see how many useful things that you haven't noticed before that there are. So it makes you much more productive and be able to do a much better solution. So, and basically this, what we talked about today, that was a very quick summary of the AZ 900. And you will learn much more, of course, by doing the online training material. So I think, yeah, it definitely makes sense as a starter.
Yes, and I would highly recommend to look at Microsoft.com/docs.com/learn, because there you have modules for all of the services, and then you can choose your tracks also if you just want to try out something. And when you do that, they usually give you a sandbox where you can try out the services also.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So I guess if you Google Microsoft Learn, then you would get to the right place, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So that's, I think that's a good resource, and I think there's multiple levels of jumping into different stuff. Like, so it's not necessarily just for beginners, but there's many different things in Microsoft Learn that can get you a good introduction to various different services, and try them out with some good exercises, I think.
Yeah, and also so much is happening all the time. So I mean, if you go back 2 years, I mean, it's so different from what it looked like now, when the same will happen again in 2 years. So that is why it's very good to go to these learning resources, because they will be updated, so you will learn the latest. So if you watch this, presentation 2 years later, and everything, oh, that's old stuff. They were talking about. It is good that Microsoft, they keep updating this learning material, and so even if you're quite good at Azure, it is good to take a look at some of this basic level stuff, because new things, that can help you get updated with the latest, really.
Yeah. Yes.
And also, if you are, let's say, doing a transition from traditional IT towards cloud IT, I mean, all your skills are really applicable. It's just a different flavor, and you just need to, do the small shift and understand the differences. But your current skills still apply.
Yeah.
Especially in networking.
Yeah. That's good. So it's not all the waste.
No.
And you can still use PowerShell.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
And you can still use PowerShell.
Yeah, just remember, the cloud is just someone else's computer.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I guess that's it for now. Thank you so much for presenting, giving us this crash course.
For inviting us.
Thank you for giving the opportunity. Yes, thank you.
Of course, my pleasure. So I'll just show this real quick. So again, thank you for joining, everyone who took the time out to follow us this evening, or who is following the recording. You can keep up to date on what's happening in the Azure user group, both on Twitter and our meetup group. Follow the channel on YouTube. And then one of our sponsors is, of course, Microsoft, who has this initiative called Azure Heroes. So if you're not familiar with that, I'd recommend go checking that out, aka.ms/azure.heroes. You can read a lot more about what that's about. But it's just a fun little initiative where you can collect badges from attending different events, like this one, or anything else online where Microsoft is a sponsor. So go check that out. There's a whole community of people who are joining into this initiative. So you can follow it on azureheroes.community. In terms of other meetups coming up from us in the Azure user group, I can say that we are planning something related to Microsoft Build. we'll have a session, I think the week after Microsoft Build, where we are talking about the announcements that were made during Build and how it affects us. So we'll have a bunch of different people joining in, both the organizing team and from the community, talking about the announcements and what exciting stuff that's been popping up during Build, and talking about it from different perspectives of if you're a consultant, which makes a lot of sense for you in terms of the announcements, and if you're working with product development, maybe there's some specific things that has an effect on your job. So we'll talk about those things the following week. That'll be announced on the meetup group. And then we are trying to find a date for another Cloud Secrets event. We have had a few of those before, and we're doing another one probably in June, I think, where we'll talk about open source secrets. So open source on Azure, mostly related to containers and some of all of the open source projects that Microsoft has. So that'll also be announced on our meetup group. So I'd recommend checking that out, subscribing to the meetups, and seeing what pops up. And I hope to see all of you again in the near future for some more Azure user group meetups. So with that, I'll just say thank you everyone for attending, and hope to see you next time. So bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.